Hi, my name's James, and I'm a sports scientist for Catapult Sports in Europe. This online workshop is looking at data analysis and methodologies in soccer. So in terms of today's workshop, these are the different topics that I'll discuss. Just to go through each one, we've basically got the data analysis of soccer, so different types of analysis that we can look at. How we then evaluate the performance of players and the sort of considerations around that. Then move on to goalkeepers, so looking at some suggestions for monitoring keepers. And then finally looking at things such as key performance indicators and also player load analysis. So in terms of data analysis in soccer, at the moment we're pretty much limited to what we can look at due to the rules enforced by the governing bodies. So as it describes at the top there, the rules currently prevent GPS being worn in competitive matches. So pretty much we're limited to looking at video-based systems. So in the UK, the typical system would be Prozone and Misco, which we can get some useful information in terms of physical variables, such as the different distances and efforts covered in velocity zones. However, due to the players not actually wearing any physical wearable technology, this does limit our information that we can get. So with things like GPS, obviously we can use the accelerometers, gyroscopes, magnetometers to get more detailed information. So without this sort of this data and this opportunity to wear it in games, then it does limit what we can actually look at as sports scientists. So in terms of analysis, then we tend to look at just the training load due to those reasons I mentioned before. And this type of data can be either objective from the GPS and used in conjunction with things such as heart rate and other methods of training load measurement. But also uses a lot of subjective data in conjunction with this as well. So your typical one would be your rating of perceived exertion, your RPE. We can also look at it in terms of acute training load. So that might be just a daily session or just a microcycle over a typical 7-day period. Or we might look at it in a longitudinal sense. So that might be a little more across a mesocycle, so around 6 to 8 weeks, or even doing month-by-month comparisons as well. And due to the teams now being able to wear devices pretty much on each player, we're collecting a lot of data and information. And the future of how this is all going is looking at it in terms of big data. So, employing companies, external companies to produce mathematical models of prediction of things like injury and potentially physical performance leading into the weekend. So that's sort of the way the data is going, but obviously we need to make sure it's all contextual to what we know about physiology. So if we talk about periodization, we can see a very basic breakdown. So we start off with our annual plan. Then we break that down in terms of a season to our off-season period, and then obviously we go into our pre-season. Typically, usually about 5 to 6 or 7 weeks at most, and then from that we've got our in-season period, which will take up most of that annual cycle. Now in football, because of the fact we do play so many games at the elite level, with some of the teams typically in the Champions League, we'll have to play 2, even 3 games within 7 days. It really becomes very important that we monitor and structure our microcycles to suit the recovery demands of each game, but then also to make sure the right training load is delivered for the guys who aren't playing as regularly as the main starting group. So take that onto board. We've got an example here on a graph which looks at what we'd say was a typical Saturday to Saturday structure. So you might have the first day off after the game, and then the second day coming for light recovery session, and then you really lead into your main training for the week. So it might be 3 or 4 sessions back to back. And from there you can see from the arrows we start off with typically our highest load either on match day -4 or match day -3. And then what we try and do is taper in, going from match day 3 to -1, and then finishing with our preparation leading into our next game. So really this would be quite an ideal sort of scenario where you've tapered in and allowed the players enough recovery, within the sort of 48 hours to, three days at most, recovery from strenuous games. However, due to certain circumstances, that might not be the case. So we have an example here where the load that was given on the recovery day was actually quite high, and then this was actually maintained across the rest of the week, and then really the only time the load's reduced is on match day -1. So this might be a typical feature when we might have had a bad result in this previous game, so we feel as though there's more training required to mend the mistakes and learn new practices, etc. So from that, this is where the GPS can come in very useful, because in the previous instance, you might have used it to create that nice pattern leading into the game. In this instance, if you had that feedback each day and then try to educate that through to the coaches, from that you might then be able to manipulate the training load through the week so that you don't have this monotonous pattern that occurs straight through the microcycle. And then if you look at it more longitudinally, you can see on this graph here we've got the red bars, which are the games, and the blue bars, which are the training. So again, it's just taking it in context from not just the 1 week, but week to week. You might have different structures. So you might have a 1 game week, for example, at the start, but then we go into an intense period of where we've got 2 game weeks, and then here it's all about recovery, so managing that load in between games. But then when you do get the opportunity, obviously then we need to hit the players with a relevant load to maintain at least, but also the potential of improving different fitness levels. So next section is looking at how do we evaluate performance. Well, the question first of all is, what is actual performance in terms of a physical output? So a lot of the time we'll say, coaches or even fans, whatever it might be, will say, he looks fit or he looks as though he's not fit. But it's really hard to define what we mean by a player's fit or not. What we do know from research is that, some of the typical match variables that we look at, so things like total distances and high speed distances, etc., they show massive variation when we look at it from game to game. So, just the fact that a player's load is decreased, a fan might look at that and say, well, he's not as fit as he was previously, he's not running as much, etc. But as we all know, that might be something to do with the tactical influence. So it might be a change in his positional instructions. He might be told to be a bit more defensive in the game as opposed to offensive. Things like this can then cause that variation. And as you can see in the study by Gregson, it's actually quite a high percentage. So that's quite difficult then when you're trying to assess performance to say whether a player's produced a good output or not from a match situation. What we also know from some research done from the guys at Lille, we know that players also can produce pretty much high or similar physical outputs despite being in a fatigued state. So the example in the Carlin paper 2012 was during a fixture congestion period, pretty much 2 game week scenario over several weeks. Players were still able to physically produce the output, so they're able to exert the same distances and things like this. But obviously if you keep playing the same players and don't allow enough recovery in between games, then that will eventually lead to injury. But again, the players will still perform when required, even if they're in a slightly fatigued state. So it's really hard to then say what a good performance is in matches, and really then it's about actually managing the player in between the games. So it's actually being able to monitor recovery to ensure that they can then play in the next game, or the opposite of that is when they've lacking that bit of match fitness, is making sure that they're ready to jump in when the manager requires. So then in terms of positional requirements, it's quite useful to then select certain variables that might be highly relevant for each position. So we use this example here where we've got a typical sort of spider chart looking at some key variables for certain defensive positions. So we've got things like sprint efforts, accelerations and decelerations, high speed distance, total distance, and also repeated high intensity efforts. So, if you look at your players, you need to be able to have a certain requirement to play each position. And looking at the data in this format can be quite useful, especially when looking at young players coming through academies, and you want to then benchmark them against the first team players to see if they can actually produce the same physical outputs that the senior guys can do. It's also useful to identify different player thresholds in terms of the training load. So we use this example in the graph here of looking at matchday minus formats again. So you can see that each player across the season might have an average or a typical load for each of those days. Obviously, with that in mind, there's also going to be some variation indicated by the SD bars here. So then it's all about creating a range of an upper and lower threshold for each player, and whether you use things like typical error, SD bars, wherever it might be. It's then about just saying, well, for that particular day, he normally has this range of data. If he's an outlier, he might go extremely high or even extremely low compared to that threshold. From that, then you can manipulate the load either during the session using the live receiver, or then you can do it in the subsequent days leading into the match preparation. And then it's all about, like we said before, just managing that load. So we use this example here where we've got a week-by-week scenario. The first week we can see that the players trained and the load has been adequately tapered into the next game. But then after a bad defeat, we can see here with the orange bars that the loads actually remained quite high, especially on the Tuesday and Wednesday, pretty much near, in terms of match volume, near enough, about 90%. And then finally, they've actually reduced it massively down to 20% on the match day -1. And then what happened here is that the player became injured because of the fatigue that was carrying through all through the week. Just by reducing the load here, the player is still fatigued from those previous days, and then playing in the full match from the start, then they became injured, and from that, obviously, we have the spell of rehab. So this is just to illustrate the importance of identifying the times to hit the players with good training load, with high training load, and when to actually drop off and allow enough recovery. And this can be done in quite a subtle way as well, in terms of daily practice. So if you use the live receiver that's provided by Catapult, you can actually then look at the player's data as each drill progresses. So you might have a target or a threshold for each player each day, depending on the objectives of the training session. So we use this example here where one of the players might be approaching quite a high load for the day, based on the previous 4 or 5 drills. And then when we go into our games at the end, so in this example, we've got a 7v7 small-sided game with a neutral player. We might then, instead of the player who's got the high load having 4 bouts, for example, so you might have, say, 4 bouts of 4 minutes or whatever it might be. We reduce that to only 2 bouts, and then we might flip it to a 7v6 situation and take the player out. Or we might allow the player to have more of a peripheral role, so he doesn't have to run around a lot, he just stays in the middle as a floater. Things like this where we just manipulate the load but still involve the player as much as we can in the session. So the idea is that we don't want to just take players out of sessions if we can avoid it. Obviously, if they need to, we will. But the idea is just to manipulate the load in a subtle way so that it just changes the types of values and the data that you get from each day. So then moving on from the outfield guys to the goalkeepers. So this is quite a hot topic at the moment in Catapult, where we're looking to develop new algorithms and calculations to look at goalkeeper type movements. So the issue we've really got is that goalkeeper training is often isolated. It's done in 2-3 goalkeepers at a time with one goalkeeper coach. Typically, we've only really looked at the simple methods, as I'd put it here. So things like RPE, possibly some heart rate monitoring as well. But due to the practicalities of GPS, mainly the size in terms of putting them onto the goalkeepers' backs and things like diving onto the backs, it's been a bit of a safety concern. So then players of the goalkeepers have not really worn them. However, with the development of the technology now and the smaller size that we have with the units, this is now allowing the goalkeepers to wear them during the training sessions. So then what we'll try and do now from now on is using the technology is actually start to build up, what the goalkeepers actually do in terms of training load. One thing we do know is that with the goalkeepers, the parameters that we would typically look at for outfield players don't really apply for the goalies. So this example here, you've got total distance for a match. So, typical values for outfield players by position is around, 10.5 to probably 12,500 meters in terms of total distance. A goalkeeper, though, might only cover around about 4 to at most 6,000 meters. So it's about half, almost 50% of what the outfield guys are doing. And then when we look at the actual high intensity work, so our sprint and our cruise speed distances, you can see here that goalkeepers only actually do around about 2.5% of what the outfield guys do. So, for example, wide midfielders might cover over 1,000 meters of high speed, whereas goalies might only cover 50 to 80 meters in a game. So what this shows really is that the goalkeepers actually require new parameters or different parameters than what we currently have and that we look at with the outfield guys. So these are the sort of actions that we really want to start to quantify. So looking at the dive counts, the dive and actions, looking at the jump movements, acceleration and deceleration we currently get from the outfield guys, but looking at this in the context of a goalkeeper, and then also the change of direction, which a lot of this work is done in the training drills as well with goalkeepers. So what Catapult developed is the new optimized G5, which is the goalkeeper unit. Now this is specifically looking at using these types of parameters that we've mentioned briefly before. So what we'll look to do from now on in is use this device to quantify things such as dive, so not only direction through left and right, but also actually the intensity of the dive, so the actual force that the goalkeeper hits to the ground in G's. We also want to look at the recovery time because we want to make sure that the keeper's back in position ready to make that next save. So we can actually do the return time of the device from a position on the floor back up to an upright position for the goalkeeper. And then we want to look at other things as well, such as the jump. So we want to see obviously the count, but also the intensity of each jump, how high of each jump. Acceleration and deceleration work is crucial for rushing out from the box and doing that type of work. Change of direction, we mentioned before, to improve the agility. And then also quite a crucial part of goalkeepers is the repeated high intensity efforts. So it's that ability to perform 2, 3, possibly 4 really intense short actions in a very short space of time. So if they're not able to fully recover from the second or the third, by the time they might need to do the fourth, then they might be fatigued and not able to produce the actual quality that they require. So this is the G5 and this is what is currently available as of now. And then we'll look to develop this over the coming months and trial it with some teams as well and start to use it. So in terms of key performance indicators then in soccer. So if we look at it in terms of an overall view, we can very generically split it into internal and external load. So the internal relates to the actual cost of the activity, whereas the external load is actually what we prescribe for that player to do. So when we look at some typical parameters used for those two categories, so for internal load we would typically look at the heart rate response, so whether that's by looking at the value in terms of percentage of a player's heart rate max. We might also look at some trimp type work, so we might have different trimp calculations where we multiply the time in the zone by a certain weighting factor depending on the research paper that you look at. We also look at things like the RPE, so in terms of actual RPE scored on the Foster scale, so 1 to 10, or we might look at it in terms of RPE load, so we're multiplying the session duration by the actual RPE. In terms of external work, we also can then look at the velocity zone, so typically we report it relative to different intensities, so we look at things like the sprint distance, we look at high speed distance, which includes a slightly lower threshold for sprint and cruise type work. The player load, which we can look at, which is a catapult zone calculation, which tries to create a sum of all the different movements that the players do. We also have acceleration and decelerations, some of the ones we mentioned for keepers, so jumps as well, change direction, and this new line of parameters, which is metabolic power, which is quite a hot topic in the sport at the moment. Quite a few teams look at it, with the research stemming from some Italian researchers. It's still in its infancy, and it's quite a promising calculation. There's certainly more work needs to be done to validate it. However, it's certainly one that it might be worth looking at in terms of your team. And then going down even further, so we've got internal and external, but then we drop it down to the next bit, which is actually very, very generically looking at volume versus intensity of a session. So some of the volume metrics might be the actual duration of the exercise, the distance they cover, total distance, the overall load, mechanical load, so that'll be your total player load, your heart rate exertion, which is a sum of all of those different zones, overall acceleration and deceleration efforts or distance, and then as we mentioned before, the session RP, or also known as RP load. And then intensity wise, we can make those sort of parameters relative to time. So we use the example of average speed of meters per minute. High speed distance is typically in some of the match data is anything above 5.5 meters per second, but this can vary between teams. Time in red zone, so this time of really when you're looking at the cardiovascular adaptations, high acceleration and deceleration efforts, so not just the total, but the actual high efforts of explosive type movements, and then the actual RP subjective score at the end of the session. So the Catapult software now has, pretty much over 100 different variables that you can look at. But the simple question is, do we actually need all of this information? So I use the example here, if we've got 25 players and we were to use 20 variables a day, when we break that down in terms of number per session, it would be 500. And times that by 7 would be 3,500. Times that by year, you're looking at 200,000 data points per year, for an annual season. So, that's by far too much information in terms of the human person being able to actually digest that information and use it on a day-to-day basis. So it might be great for these mathematical models, this big data approach, but most teams in soccer don't have the resources to do that type of work. So you might have maybe one fitness coach, or you might have, if you're lucky, you might have some interns who can do some projects for you. But typically we just want to have simple key variables that we stick to each day, and then we can use them to make changes to our practice. The main part which a lot of people, particularly in the applied setting, will actually overlook is what's the reliability and validity of these parameters. So if we are going to select our 5 or 6 key performance indicators, are they within an acceptable range of reliability, and also are they valid against the criterion measure? So we need to always factor in those types of things when looking at our data, particularly when things like the smallest worthwhile change or practical change between each session day to day. And finally, just talk a little bit about player load analysis. So, the GPS is useful. It can provide good information on the velocity and the distances and things like this, but the future of where the GPS work is going is actually through the integration of the inertial sensors, so the accelerometer, the gyroscope and the magnetometer. And then one of those parameters which has been around for a little while now is the player load analysis. This has been published in the research literature as well by several papers, so it's the calculation is well known and also been validated against different measures. And it's the way it's calculated, it's by determining all of the movement, so accelerations, jumps, changes of direction at different intensities, different velocity zones, and then creating a weighting factor for each of those based on the intensity of the movement, and then creates just that one number that you can look at. However, this number is actually very individual, so it depends on things like the position of the player, the actual size of the player, the weight of the player. Things like this can differ, makes the value differ between players. So then the key part is that when you look at this type of information, you don't tend to look at it across the squad for one session. You look at it for each individual across time, longitudinally. So that's the actual formula there. As I described before, you've got 3 different axes that we look at. So you've got forward, sideways, and upwards. And we've got basically our calculation there that creates the sum of all those 3 planes of direction, and then creates the one value at the end. So I use this example here to highlight what I've just mentioned, where we've got player 1 and player 2. Both players have covered the same amount of distance, so the same external work. However, when you look at the player load response, we can see here that the player 1 has got a player load of 250, but player 2 is actually only 150. So, if you looked at that, you'd say maybe player 2's just moves a lot more efficiently. So that might be one possible explanation. Player 1 might just be tired. So even though he's done the same external work, it's cost them a lot more. Or the third part could be the fact that, as we mentioned before, different sizes, different types of players and people, it just causes that value to be higher for that player. In this example, though, we might then say, okay, so we've increased the volume, and now it's actually switched. So player 2's player load is actually now higher than what it was with the previous one. And it's actually then going across sessions. So we've got session 1 and then session 2. So even though the distances are the same, so still 7,000 meters in both sessions, the player loads is actually increased between the two. So this example, should illustrate it for one player. And then what we're trying to say here is that even though he's done the same external work, his player load is actually increased quite a lot, substantially, almost double. So then that might indicate that he might be carrying some sort of injury, or he might be less efficient in his movements. And this might explain why this type of data is being shown here. So, thanks very much for listening to the workshop. Very brief and just touched on a few points there that might create some discussion, hopefully. If you do want to email Catapult to follow up and to ask any questions, then feel free to email myself there at james@catapultsports.com. Also, as well, if you want to provide some feedback on the actual workshop and the structure, how we might improve it, feel free to email our marketing director, which is Bowden Westover, with his email address there as well. Okay, thank you very much for listening.